welcome all our viewers to the episode The Testimony of Saints. In this episode we deliver the testimony of our late Chief Pastor A.C. Thomas. Early life. The late Pastor A.C. Thomas was one who could say with St. Paul that God had separated him from his mother's womb. At the time of his birth, there was a great revival in his locality. But the baptism of the Holy Spirit was still unknown to the Christians of his day. We were many other deeper doctrines of the Bible. He was born on 13th of June, 1907 of middle-class parents at Cheruvla, Kolakadavu of Alapi district in Kerala. At the age of 2.5 years, due to some kind of sickness, he was considered to be dead. The poor bereaved mother prayed over the body of the child and asked God to restore him back to life. She promised that she would dedicate the child to God if her prayers were answered. God granted her request and the child came back to life. While still a boy, little Thomas' mother often reminded him of the consecration she had made, but he showed little interest in doing the Lord's work. Instead, he set his mind to continue his studies. On completion of his studies, he set out for Ceylon in search of a job and secured one. As encounter with God, at the age of 23, he had a visitation from the Lord. He heard the voice of the Lord reprimanding him for an offense he had committed. Heavy conviction came upon him. In penitence, he sought forgiveness from the Lord. When he rose up from that place, he had the assurance that his sins were forgiven and that he was a child of God. On a certain day in the year 1935, young Thomas was seeking for a solitary place to pray. He came across a church, and having obtained permission from the watchman, spent a considerable time in prayer. As he walked out of the church, it was already getting dark. He saw a man walking ahead of him with Bible in hand. From the dress he wore and as he was carrying a Bible, Thomas recognized him as a servant of God. Becoming more curious, he inquired as to who he was. He replied that he was a son of God. On further inquiry regarding his experiences, he learnt that the stranger had left his place a week ago and was now on his way home. He therefore invited Thomas to accompany him so that he could tell him more. As they walked along, the man talked to him about Jesus and the way of salvation. At about 9 o'clock they reached their destination. It was a humble abode and there was no light inside. The roof being low, one had to bend low in order to enter in. His wife, too, was a godly woman. Though very poor in material goods, they were rich in spiritual experiences. Realizing the poor conditions under which they lived, young Thomas handed out a little money to the couple. Some oil for the lamps and groceries were immediately purchased. A quick meal was provided and his hunger satisfied. But more refreshing than this was the spiritual conversation which Thomas enjoyed very much. When he finally left the place, it was nearly midnight. He could not find his way back home, but in answer to prayer was miraculously led to the church. It was 1:30 a.m. when he reached there. Ministry foretold. It was now deal to young Thomas that God was guiding him. He could not sleep that night. So he kept meditating on the words he had heard from that man of God. At about 2 o'clock, the Lord spoke to Thomas and asked him to read Isaiah chapter 8. Thomas obeyed, and while reading, the 18th verse carried a special message to him. Behold, I and the children the Lord hath given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. You will be a sign and a wonder. God told young Thomas. It dawned on Thomas that he was in the presence of the Lord. Turning off the lights, he sat down. Just then, the voice of the Lord came to him clear and sharp. Thomas, did you ever say that you would not marry? Asked the Lord. Yes, Lord, Thomas replied. Why? The Lord further asked. My devotion is necessary to consolidate my household, was his reply. Is not the whole world one family which needs to be consolidated? I want you to be a co-worker with me in this great task, the Lord said. Who will look after the children entrusted to me by parents who have gone on field work? The Lord went on, I want you to take up that responsibility also. God put many other questions to him, but Thomas could not answer them. God himself replied such questions and convinced him. Many questions were asked by Thomas to which the Lord replied. It was truly a dialogue between God and man. Forsaking all, the Lord told Thomas that he should forsake his all in literal terms according to Luke 14:26-33 and come out for the ministry. He should have nothing in this world to be called his own and he should become nothing. How could it be possible for anyone to lead such a life was Thomas' question. Out of nothing, did I not create the universe? Asked the Lord. I shall create a new man out of you only when you come to the state of nothingness, said the Lord. Young Thomas rejoiced at this and decided to consecrate his job and everything he had. The Lord spoke again. Look around. Don't you see many men, women and children? They are all your brothers, sisters and mothers, and I want to give them all to you. But how can I unless you consecrate your father, mother, sisters and brothers? Did I not promise you, I will give you the whole world? Thomas did not hesitate to consecrate his whole household and his relatives too. Later he was called upon to consecrate his Bible also. At this Thomas was somewhat puzzled and doubted whether God really wanted him to do so. God clearly showed him that since he had bought it with his own money, he had to consecrate that also. He further promised to give him a new Bible and to meet all his other needs. His consecration was now complete, and in his own words he now felt very light as though floating in the air. The conversation between God and Thomas lasted from 2 a.m. until 5 a.m. in the morning. Stepping out of the church, he raised his hands heavenwards and said, Lord, I have nothing in this world except thee and thee alone. To this the Lord said, if you have me, you have everything. I called Abraham to walk with me, and I am calling you also to walk with me, I and you and you and I. All may forsake you, but I will not. Will you forsake me? Asked the Lord. No, Lord, by thy grace I will not, replied Thomas. Later incidents proved that he walked with God and was united to him till the very end. Meeting the saints, having made the consecrations required of the Lord, Thomas now faced a problem: where shall I serve the Lord and how shall I do it? The next day, November 27, 1935. God marvelously brought him to the fellowship of the Ceylon Pentecostal mission. A whole night he spent in the faith home. There, he saw two patients, one suffering from malaria and the from diarrhea. He immediately took upon himself the responsibility of attending on them. That night, God spoke many things to him, revealing his future ministry. The following day, he attended a convention conducted by the CPM in Colombo. There he obeyed the Lord in the waters of baptism, but to become a servant of God in the CPM, he had to fulfill 3 conditions. He had to consecrate his all. This he had already done. He should have received the baptism of the Holy Spirit and should have a good testimony from the church. Thomas could not fulfill the 2 latter conditions. He had not received the fullness of the Spirit and was altogether a stranger to CPM. This led him to pray to God that he might speak to the leaders of the church so that he would be accepted into the ministry. In the morning, as he was making preparations to leave, Pastor Paul, standing afar off, beckoned him and said, "You are a chosen vessel. God has called you to the ministry. Receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit and serve the Lord." With these instructions, be entrusted Brother Thomas to Brother Cavalcadon Matthew's care and said, "Brother, here is a new convert. Look after him and keep him." This elderly servant of God explained to him about the work of the CPM, the growing responsibilities and the high demands of the ministry. He added, "Do not think all those in the ministry are saints. But you must decide to live the life of a saint in their midst. They are here in order that you may be sanctified." He further said, "Do not make friendships in the ministry which might lead to formation of cliques, for example, Tamil for Tamilians, Malayalam for Malayalees and so on. All should be treated as brothers and sisters, and no room should be left for segregation of any kind. Looking back over the years, Pastor Thomas referred to this particular point, in his latter days, as being the one factor that ruined the spiritual lives of many saints. You may see and hear many things, but you should close your eyes and ears to that, he was told, Isaiah 42 hours 19 minutes, 20. These and other advisers stood Thomas in good stead in his latter life and ministry. Spirit baptism and early ministry. Days later, he received the baptism of the Holy Spirit. He lived a blameless and victorious life. True to his promise, God gave him many sisters, brothers and children. He was also given the responsibility of teaching about 30 children at the faith school in Matacalia, Colombo. He did not shrink from physical labor of any kind, be it ever so low. The time he spent with God, the wise counsel given by his seniors, coupled with the rich variety of his own experiences, prepared him for the gigantic task ahead. A few years later, as a young worker, he was sent to Kerala, South India in 1943, when the work was at a low ebb. He took charge of the work in Tiruvalla, using it as the main operative base. At the time he was sent there, the people wondered whether he would be able to handle the situation, being so very young in age as well as in experience. But very soon, their doubts were dispelled as the grace of God was manifested in his ministry. Those were difficult days when he had to go through much privation and hardships. This included traveling for miles on foot, going for days without proper food, clothing or shelter. He discharged his duties well, consolidated the work and brought it to its present standard. It can truly be said that the signs of an apostle were fulfilled in him as those referred to by St. Paul in 2 Cor. 12:10-12. The work grows. By the grace of God, the work flourished under his ministry in Kottarakara, Kottayam, and Trivandrum as well. He expended his energies in the service of the Lord, and today there are many branch faith homes in these areas. Later, he was sent to Madras, where he had to face a barrage of opposition from various other Christian factions. Through it all, the Lord stood by him and the work was established. Another place where his ministry became very fruitful was in Bombay. The Lord gave him many precious souls as a result of his untiring labors. In foreign fields, all along, the Lord was shaping him for greater responsibility and leadership in the ministry. In the later 50s he was sent to France to take up responsibilities there. Not having a home, unable to speak or understand the language, nor able to withstand the weather, he suffered very much. God enabled him to set up a faith home in Paris. Making that as a center, he visited other places and established the work in France. Later, he went to the USA for a brief period and labored there until he was called back to India to shoulder the responsibilities of the general work. God gave him co-workers wherever he went and supplied all his spiritual and material needs. By this time, the work had been established in France, England, Malaysia, and Singapore. The work in India and Ceylon too had grown much since. He had the care of all the churches, and there was no room for prejudices of any kind in his life and ministry. Noble attributes. Some of the outstanding characteristics of his life were his deep consecration, his persevering prayer, and his blameless life. His daring faith enabled him to face all of life's problems fearlessly. The secret of his victorious life, he would say, was applying the principle, Thomas must die for Christ to live. This he often repeated in the trials that he encountered. He worked side by side with Pastor Freddie Paul, bringing the church out through turbulent times during the 60s. Right through the 26 years of his ministry in Madras, he worked along with Pastor C. John, cooperating in every way towards the building up of the church. He not only saw to the spiritual welfare of the worker under him, but was also concerned about housing, accommodation, and other necessities for them at the training homes in Madras and elsewhere. Concern of youths. He would always say that the youths were the backbone of the church and would listen to their common problems. Particularly on his last visit to Singapore, the youths asked for a special meeting that they might clear their doubts. He immediately agreed to their wishes. He discussed freely with the youths on problems facing them in modern society. There was such a free atmosphere of mutual understanding that they felt they were not in the presence of a pastor, but in the presence of a father. The youths were frank and forthright in bringing out the real issues. The questions raised were all answered to their satisfaction. He had often arranged youth meetings and youth camps in various other parts of the world. He encouraged the youths to take an active role in the church and was quite at home with them wherever he went. Literature work. As regards literature, he was very concerned that the Bible truths we teach be put into print. He wrote the book entitled An Exposition of the Book of Revelation and several others which are in circulation. He was eager to see that these vital truths are clearly understood by every child of God. He also encouraged others in writing the doctrines of the church to ward off erroneous teachings and practices entering into the church. The last lap, during the last stages of his life, although very weak in body, he did not make this an excuse to refrain from serving his master. His burden was to finish the work God had entrusted to him. He knew that he was nearing the end of his race, but he kept pressing on, knowing that he would soon see his master's face. His one main concern was the holiness and sanctification of the servants of God. At the last ministers' meeting, he emphasized the importance of the victorious life in preparation for Mount Zion was his constant meditation and all-consuming theme, especially so as he was nearing the closing moments here on earth. Awake, awake, put on thy strength, O Zion, put on thy beautiful garments. 0 Jerusalem, the holy city, Isaiah 52:1, was the theme of his message given at the monthly meeting at Kotarakara, just a fortnight before he went to be with the Lord. He was called to glory at Tiruvla on Monday, 21st June at 12 to 27 p.m. and his body was laid to rest at Madras. He has left us a rich heritage and an exemplary life to follow. He being dead, yet speaketh.
I was glad